good morning, and again, thanks for taking the time to join us again. But yeah, I suppose we'll start very quickly with a few brief introductions. So we'll cover myself, my colleague Liv, our guest speaker Amanda, go into Prodo very quickly as well in terms of how we sort of fit into the sector. We do record these sessions as well, so it'd be great if everyone could sort of keep the mics muted for the time being, but please do feel free to make use of that chat pane as well to ask any of us, particularly Amanda as well, any specific questions on what we're going to be covering today, and we'll get to those again. We have had a few through the registration form as well, so we'll address those, and then yeah, we'll move on to covering the main topic of today, which is going to be all focused around that resident-centric innovation piece, very much linking that back to the consumer standards and that change of regulation which we covered last month, which you'll all be familiar with and I'm sure working towards regardless. And then yeah, as I say, we'll have some time at the end for some sort of live Q&A as well, so do feel free when we get to that point, or even throughout, pop those questions in. Myself and Liv will look to field those with Amanda as well. But yeah, I suppose that's the agenda for today, so we'll get started. So yeah, just to start with, my name's Jacob. I'm head of sales at Prodo, so my role is specifically around sort of very early stages. We get involved with early stage consultancy services to look to explore requirements with housing associations across the country, and then look to sort of facilitate the implementation of solutions for those with the likes of consultancy services. We have a suite of digital products, including self-service portals and apps, but also web development's always been a big part of what we do. But yeah, as an agency, we specialise in the housing sector for over 20 years, working with hundreds throughout that time, including most of the G15. But everything that we sort of put forward in terms of our offering in the space is essentially based upon the evolution of the challenges and ambitions of the space as well. Obviously, regulation's a big part of that. But what we tend to hear is a sort of a drive towards organisations needing to build trust with customers, needing to unlock that capacity based upon that situation of having to do more with less, essentially, and ultimately looking to transform customer experience for those digital natives, but also those people who maybe are possibly digitally excluded, or have more sort of higher complex needs. That's kind of where we fit into the sector. Liv, do you want to say a quick hello as well?
Hello, I'm Liv. I'm an account director here at Prodo. So I work closely with many clients on kind of talking around resident-centric innovation, and also kind of how that ties into regulation and things like that. So looking forward to this session with Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Liv. I suppose then on to today's topic and reintroducing Amanda from last month as well.
Thanks, guys. So nice to see you all. For those of you who were here last month, as Jake said, we're going to be building on some of the themes around consumer regulation and really getting into that detail of what it means in terms of customer engagement and how you connect and engage with customers to ensure you not only meet the consumer standards but also improve the service experience. So for those of you who weren't here last month or don't know me, I do know a few of you anyway. I've worked in the private sector for about 18 years in customer facing roles. My last role was Senior Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement and Communication for Compass Group, who are the world's largest catering company operating in 91 different countries. So I've had that experience of working with different cultures, different legal requirements, which again are all factors to consider when you're talking about customer experience. I also worked for Sainsbury's and Granada PLC, and I've worked in communications, HR and operations. I'm now the CEO of Perfect Storm, and I work across the housing sector with the NHF, Housemark, various housing associations and local authorities. And I work here with Prodo on transformation and customer engagement, and in particular working with resident groups and staff teams across housing associations and local authorities on service design, and really looking at, the best way to design the service, the best way to engage customers as well. I did also lead on the first post-Grenfell resident engagement roadshows. Some of you may be familiar that post-Grenfell, the housing minister of the time, had several housing ministers since then, of course, because they tend to change at least once a year, sometimes more. But I led on that first resident engagement, working with the Cabinet Office the Housing Minister and East of England landlords to really connect and understand some of the challenges that residents and tenants felt. And that consultation exercise was actually the thing that started the process of developing the white paper that has now turned into what we're seeing as consumer regulation, which is live on April the 1st. So that's a bit about my background. I have worked in the housing sector for about 13 years now. So although my background is out of housing sector, I've led on quite a few mergers, some quite complex mergers, including Clarion, integration for Carbon Homes up in the northeast. So lots of different things around engagement. So hopefully I can share some of that with you today. Thanks, Jay.
Great stuff. Thanks, Amanda. So I know we were going to start, weren't we, just to begin with that sort of sector context piece again.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone was here last month, you'll see that we touched on this last time. But I think before we can spend any time even thinking about how to engage with customers, how to design services in an innovative way, you've got to really think about the landscape that you're all wrestling with. We know that consumer regulation is live on the 1st of April. The first round of post-pilot inspections. There was obviously 2 series of pilots for the new regulatory inspections, but now we are starting to see dates coming in for housing associations who are due their inspections, and those are going to be happening from April the 1st. We know we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Supply chain costs and supply chain scarcity is having an enormous impact, because at the same time when landlords are facing reduced revenue in real terms because of the rent cap and seeing the cost of borrowing go higher, we're also seeing the cost of materials and the cost of doing business increasing as well. So all of those things lumped in together are causing enormous capacity challenges. And you'll see when I come on to talk about the case study that capacity is really, really key if you're going to get this right, because there is no silver bullet here. It takes long, hard yards to really get this right. We know decarbonisation, the targets that we've got, and the impact that the ageing profile of a lot of stock across the sector has on how challenging it is to be working on retrofit and decarbonisation targets. Building safety remains a challenge, particularly for those organisations with a high density of high-rise properties and an ageing stock profile. And we know that there are significant competing demands for asset investment. So costs are going up, programmes are significant. We're still facing backlogs post-pandemic, actually, in cyclical repairs as well. And decency and stock condition is not only a significant part of new regulation, but is also incredibly high profile at the moment, following all of the damp and mould scandal that we had last year, which is still prevalent today. So thanks, Jake. If we just go on to the next slide. All of that really points to the fact that we've got this giant plate that's overflowing, and every single day leaders, managers, executive teams, people who are working in operational roles delivering frontline services are having to wrestle with all of these things. Now, the sector used to be really, really good at reacting, and still is pretty good actually at reacting. You know, if we say to the sector as a whole, this is going to happen, people tend to get behind it and galvanise around it. And we'll talk a little bit about the role that consumer regulation is playing in galvanising people into action. But the problem is, if we continue to take that really reactive approach to some of these things here, you know, I'm calling it the whack-a-mole strategy. You know, we know that we've got significant housing ombudsman maladministration cases, you know, the highest that they've been for a while. We're trying to get ready for this new style of inspection that replaces the old IDA, the old in-depth assessment that the regulator conducted. The media coverage at the moment is pouring petrol on that bonfire and talking significantly about how the sector isn't good enough and the sector needs to step up. We know that satisfaction with complaints is significantly depleted. I'll give you a stat here. I write Housemarque's monthly pulse report and work with Housemarque. They published a half-year look at the TSMs because they were involved in developing those tenant satisfaction measures. Complaints, as an example, only 34% satisfaction with how my landlord is handling my complaint. I mean, that's a staggering figure, isn't it? And that's the complaints that are formal. That is not sentiment, how people are feeling maybe around the edges if they haven't made a complaint. We know that contact centre call volumes are through the roof. And it's one of the reasons we're so passionate about really understanding your customers at Prodo and using that understanding to allow people to communicate with you through a channel of choice. So not this digital by default, but digital because you really, really understand your customers, and those who want to interact digitally can. And that will then unlock capacity, which, as we said at the start, is really challenging for landlords, and also help reduce some of those contact centre call volumes and, of course, call waiting times and call drop-offs. We know we've got misaligned technology across the sector. We've got lots of bolted on things that don't talk to other things, and lots of technology companies, which is quite interesting for me, isn't it, being here as a technology company talking about technology companies. But I think, you know, there has been promises in the past of technical solution and silver bullet to solve all of these problems, but you know, taking that step back, we actually believe that you start with understanding your customers and understanding those needs and preferences. We know as well that the sector's digitally very immature. The sector average for digital channel communication still only sits at around a third. It's about 33%. It hovered around the 25% mark for a number of years. We saw it skyrocket through the pandemic for obvious reasons, and we've seen it creep back down before it started to creep up slightly. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. You know, some of you may be sat here today thinking, well, you know, we're at 60% or 70%, or you know, with these odd examples that are even higher. But typically, that's where the sector median average sits. And we know that we've got too much data in too many places. We're totally overwhelmed by data. So the moral of this slide, I guess, the moral of the story is we've got to start whacking the moles because there's too many to whack. You know, unless we step back and take a long, hard look at how we design in a different approach, we're never going to nail transforming the customer experience. So thanks, Jake. I'm just going to touch very briefly now as a reminder on consumer regulation, which I know you all probably know about, but 4 new consumer standards, April the 1st, were live. A new inspection style assessment process that now for the first time will include a C grade, so a consumer grade, as well as the G grade, which is the governance grade, and the V grade, which is the viability grade. So this is the first time the new C grade will come into force. There are enhanced enforcement powers. This includes greater fines, strengthened consequences, short notice, you know, can come in and inspect at 48 hours notice if the regulator believes there is a problem in an organisation. There's a larger, well-resourced regulator. Landlords have seen the fees they pay to support regulation increase. And the regulator is recruiting lots of different roles to help mobilise this new regime of consumer regulation. So the regulator is going to be geared up to come and deal with this enhanced consumer regulation. The Housing Ombudsman has been established a while now in this current format. Well-established, high-profile regime. Very balanced, actually. If you're objective and you step back and look, you'll often see case studies of positive examples of where landlords have delivered something really effectively, but also lots and lots of profile on maladministration claims and challenges. And you know, the sector again does have a bit of a habit of repeating the same mistakes. Political expectations are in writing. The Secretary for State has written to landlords to outline concerns, to outline expectations, and that is something that's happened several times in the last 2 years. We know that we've got challenges with decency. There's a new Decent Homes 2 standard coming. We've got AWAB's law, and we've also got what I mentioned earlier, quite an increase in this media backdrop and quite a lot of activism. And I'm not saying activism in a negative way, because, you know, activism is an important part of democracy. But all of those things together, the activism, the changes in legislation, the high profile media coverage, that's adding more pressure on landlords. I always like to describe it as, it's a bit like you're trying to fix everything and you're trying to sort everything, you're trying to get your data in order, and you're trying to understand your customers, and you're trying to transform technology, and you're trying to work with your customers to really understand what they want, but you're kind of doing it in a shop window with your trousers around your ankles, because all of this stuff is going on. All of this stuff's going on. It's all very public. It's all, you know, and you could be in the middle of doing something really systematically and really effectively, and then suddenly one thing can come out the woodwork, and it's everywhere. And suddenly everybody kind of really starts then to kind of panic about that one thing, and then it takes us back on that journey. So I'm going to talk about, you know, in the questions and answers, how we can maybe sustain that journey a little bit more effectively. Okay, so thanks, Jake.
You're right. It's interesting with that C grade coming in, isn't it? Because we talk a lot about, and we see lots, just going back to your point on the sort of the media coverage and what's being put out there. You see quite consistently, don't you, if an organisation does reach the G1, V1 sort of ratings, it's quite a big deal's made of that, because it is, you know, potentially lots of work goes into it, and you sort of assume that on that basis that, okay, this organisation's addressing those things quite proactively and committing lots of resource and effort to it in terms of the wider strategy. But similarly, on the other side of that, if there is a downgrade on those sort of towards the, you know, the 2s or the 3s, again, that there's quite a big deal made of that, isn't there? So with that C coming into place specifically around the consumer, it's definitely one that, you know, everyone needs to, I suppose, be prepared for, but prepared for in the right way, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, won't it? And of course, we've seen a lot of B grades go from a V1 to a V2. So V2 is still a compliant grade. It's a grade that a lot of particularly developing associations, are now graded V2 because the capacity that's in the system is reduced. So a V2 still means you're compliant. It just means that you're not able to react to a wide range of economic shocks, basically. I won't go too technical because it's not a finance webinar, but yeah, okay, thanks, Jake. So we'll touch, I think, on that's just a reminder of the 4 standards. It's obviously consumer regulation is much wider than just these 4 standards, but if anyone isn't familiar with these 4 standards, do take a look, because in particular today we're going to be focused on that transparency, influence and accountability, but also, of course, all 4 of them: tenancy, neighbourhood and community, and safety and quality. Thank you, Jake. Okay, so I'm going to use a case study here from an organisation some of you may know in the east of England, in Essex, CHP, and the approach that we took to working with CHP was totally customer focused. It took 18 months to design the structure and the charter that I'm going to share with you, and I've got examples of where we've done this in other places slightly differently, but the underlying theme here is how this was designed by customers, by tenants, by residents, and also how long it took to go on that journey to do it properly, because there's a lot of buzzwords around at the moment around co-design, and, you know, I don't like the phrase co-design because I think the sector, I'm being provocative now, so do challenge me in the Q&As, but I think the sector has an idea of what it wants to do, and then we get groups of customers together and we ask them what we think, and we consult with them, and then we say this was co-designed. That's not co-design. You know, I like to call it working together. You get in a room and you actually do the design together, and this is what we did here at CHP, and this is what I'm going to share with you. So what we did was we got in a room together. Thanks, Jake. We got in a room together with different groups of customers, a cross section of customers, and we said, let's talk about the challenges, and we didn't talk about anything else. And several of those sessions only concentrated on challenges. And the reason they concentrated on challenges is, if you don't allow customers to vent, to share, to engage, to talk about the things that are really troubling them, it will always be like this thing on your shoulder all the way through. And what will happen is when you get into the point of design, people will be harping back to a load of stuff that hasn't been sorted, that started the motivation for people wanting to get involved, because often engaged customers get involved because there's been a problem. Sometimes the problem can be the starting point, which doesn't necessarily matter. You know, engagement's engagement. But we spent quite a lot of time, and what we did was we channeled those challenges and problems and turned them into asks. So what we did was we said, right, let's really think about, if that challenge was resolved, or if that issue was resolved, what would the ask be? What would you be asking CHP to do? So you're turning it into something you can do something about, rather than just this sentiment that's hanging in the air. Once we'd agreed what the asks would be, we then developed a series of commitments, and those commitments were developed into a charter. And there's a really big significant milestone here with this CHP case study, because CHP have written the charter, their customer charter, into their rules and legal articles of the association. So that means that if the exec team or the board or whoever woke up one morning and said, oh, I don't really like this structure anymore, it's, you know, it doesn't really, this charter, it's not really working for me, they wouldn't actually be allowed to change it without formally changing the rules of the organisation. Now they can change, of course, because things evolve over time. They can change the, you know, the actual structure or the names or the priorities, etc. But the sentiment and the principles of this charter and this structure, which I'm just going to show you in a second, are enshrined in the rules of the organisation. So this is really putting their money where their mouth is. You know, this is saying, we're so serious about this, we're actually going to put this in the rules of the association. So the charter implemented a customer review panel to review service quality and scrutinise services. Big part of consumer regulation, our customers reviewing and scrutinising services. It allowed a diverse group of customers to work together to influence performance, services, processes, procedures, and make recommendations directly to the Customer Experience Committee. And I'll show you how that fits into the governance structure in a minute. Implementing a community and communications group who will work together to improve communication, generating ideas, generating content, and getting that dialogue going, but also having visibility and presence in communities. So instead of saying, oh, customers have told us about this, let's write this in the newsletter, actually being out in communities and going, you know what do you care about? What matters to you? What would you like to see more of? And making sure that all of the channels and all of the communication activity was then reflected from the work of that community and communications group. And that community and communications group are connecting with repairs operatives, people going in to do gas servicing, neighbourhood officers. So you're really getting that, your arms around the whole neighbourhood. Often structures for engagement fail because you don't get enough people interested, and I think we've had a question in on that actually, which I can answer in a moment, but this is a way of making sure those tentacles are out as wide as possible, because when the feedback is captured, it's got somewhere to go, it's got a home, it's got a structure, it can be embedded in the organisation. And then the third area was the diversity and inclusion group, who are working together to make sure that the needs and preferences of customers are understood. And this is a group, a customer-led group, not just a data project, not just a technology project, a customer-led group that are helping those departments who are working with the data, working with the technology, to really understand customers' needs and preferences. And then the chairs of the three groups share information. So that charter is enshrined in the rules. So Jake, the last slide from me, and then I'll stop. And we'll deal with questions. This is the actual structure. So the top bit, it might look like an awful lot, but if the top bit is probably the first two lines that are going to be very similar to how all your organisations look today. You have a board and you have some formal governance committees. So, you know, treasury and investment, audit and risk, customer experience, and remuneration committee. Most organisations have something similar to that. They might be called different things, but that's a typical kind of governance structure. And then at the bottom, and I'm going to come to the middle level in a minute, at the bottom, all the things that often happen across organisations: task and finish groups, service review groups looking at different things. Your views on the news was a little panel that looked at what went in the newsletter, but again, it was a very small panel. sounding boards where they get groups of customers together to go, what do you think about the rent letter? Or now what was happening before this structure was you had the big formal governance bit, and you had all these things happening in the organisation. What you didn't have was a home for all of that insight, all of that sentiment, all of that feedback on service design to go into. And now this new structure, those 3 boxes that I touched on in the charter, are the home that all of that rich insight and data and sentiment goes into, and that formally then goes into the governance structure of the organisation. So the board are directly hearing things from the customer, and that's what we did at CHP. So that was it. Thank you, Jake.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you mentioned before around sort of getting those tentacles out there to capture all of these things, but also sort of bringing those through into that central home for action to happen all the way up to the board and linked to the rules. You do hear stories, and we've seen it, haven't we, in terms of, we talk a lot about data being here, there and everywhere in the housing sector. There's lots of it, lots of customer data, lots of stock data, separate systems. There's also lots of customer feedback data and sort of different sources of that coming in. But yeah, that point on digital immaturity, I suppose, and not having that home, it is almost just kind of ticking a customer surveying or customer feedback box if it's not going to that central place and feeding into that wider strategy, because otherwise change can't happen off the back of it, I suppose, which kind of, I suppose, feeds into the regulatory change in terms of having that C grade as well. But yeah, it's really interesting to see how all of that sort of feeds through that customer experience piece, I suppose. Yeah. So thank you for that, Amanda.
Thank you.
And yeah, I suppose just to touch on before we do get into the questions, for us, we kind of touched upon the beginning around, you know, what we look to try and achieve with lots of what we do with this is the building of trust and the unlocking of capacity to sort of action these things. And it does always start with knowing customer sentiment, insight, data, learning and engaging on that. And to your point before, Amanda, around that house mark data generally being sort of association with 33% roughly of digital, and I can see there's some people on the call today who we work with who are a lot higher than that, and yeah, also sort of attached to that. Exactly, yeah. also kind of attached to that is typically we'll find that when that digital engagement goes up, we also see an uptrend in satisfaction to some extent as well, sometimes quite significantly. But always when we see that success from a digital engagement perspective, and also linked to that, the satisfaction based upon the feedback and the surveying, it's always been driven by customer-led service design at the beginning, you know, as part of a wider sort of piece, rather than just, we know we need to get something in place from a digital engagement point of view. Let's just sort of put that in there and sort of hope that solves it, because we've seen that happen many times in the past as well. Whereas if it is based around the two-way communication sort of service-led delivery model for service improvements as a whole, specific to customers, because obviously we work with a lot of organisations with different types of sort of customer segments as well. That's sort of how we've seen success and benefits best, I suppose, with these projects.
And I think some of the work that we're doing in Prodo, I'm working with Jake on a couple and Liv on a couple as well. And you know, I think what we're trying to do is we're really trying to get underneath and fast track that process of really understanding your customers, really understanding the customer journey and the user experience, and then making sure that design then goes into anything that you implement as a technical solution and a multi-channel experience. Because as Jake said, if you start with the tech and you don't do both, it's less likely to be adopted. I'm not saying it's impossible for it to be adopted, and I do hear that there are opinions across the sector, and which I challenge a little bit, actually, because there are opinions across the sector that, oh, I'm really worried that if I go digital, I'll end up, you know, my satisfaction will be lower. Actually, where digital is forced and it's implemented badly, and it's not based on understanding customers' needs and preferences, and therefore customer choice led, absolutely satisfaction will be lower. But if you do it properly and it's a channel of choice, satisfaction will be higher. And we've got the data on that in Prodo, and it's, you know, quite staggering, the stats. Jake, I don't know if is that a good point, just to touch very briefly on that methodology, and then we can dive into some of the questions, just because it's quite simple, and I just wanted people to get a sense of how simple it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if you flick over, I think, yeah, there we go. So yeah, so what I've just described is that. So it's aligned to regulation, and we start off looking at experience, reviewing the sentiment, focus groups and workshops. And because we kind of understand that alignment at the start, it's very easy to kind of then take that and go, right, okay, this is what this is telling us, and then that bespoke action plan delivers the outcomes. So that's, thanks, Jake.
Absolutely that, yeah. And this is it's kind of the methodology we've used a lot over the years and kind of tailored it more so recently, because we know that it's often a case of competing priorities, and we know we need to address X, Y, and Z, but sort of where do we start? So this is essentially the overarching methodology which we use to either scale up or down based upon need. Sometimes it's quite specific into a particular area, sometimes it's quite widespread. In terms of looking at various different customer facing channels and sort of potential blocker to satisfaction within there, sort of regulation linked. Sometimes it's sort of a smaller scale. So it is the overarching methodology we're using quite successfully at the moment, but the output is always very sort of custom and bespoke to that particular organisation and the types of customers they look after as well. So yeah, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn or pop us a message if you'd like to hear a little bit more about that or any case studies that we have on it too. So yeah, onto the Q&A side of things, really. I'm not sure, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if anyone's popped any new ones through, but we have had a number through the form earlier. So I don't know if you want to pick up on those, Liv, if that's all right.
Yeah, no problem. So if you do have any questions here and now, please pop them in the chat. So some of these questions came from contacts before the session, as Jake said, but some of them we've come up with as well for Amanda. So first question was, what common challenges and blockers do you see when it comes to housing associations attempting to implement customer-led service design?
Thanks. Great question. And there are plenty. Capacity is probably the main one. I think typically it's in the too difficult box. I think what's happening is, because there are stretches on capacity, people are trying to do things quite quickly, and there is this perception that if we do it through a co-designed or a working together type approach, it's just going to take forever and there'll be loads of voices and they'll all be different. But I think that the challenge is consumer regulation requires it to be done in that way. So what you have to do is you have to kind of bite the bullet really and start to engage and capture that feedback really, really early, and then embed that feedback in to the work that you're doing. So some of those challenges would be around systems alignment as well. People are concerned that they may get feedback that they then can't address because they're constrained by a system. And systems transformation, we know from some research that we did back in the autumn last year at Prodo, we know that fear of disruption, of technology disruption, is one of the biggest barriers to shifting channel. So I think one of the that also has then an impact on, I don't really want to ask customers, because if they tell me something I can't fix because I'm wedded to a system or an approach, then I can't do something about that. But I think if you strip it back to absolute basics, those barriers of data, of technology, of not having enough time, they're all manageable. They're all manageable. It's a bit unusual for someone who does work quite closely in the data space to say that data is only one part of the puzzle, because I really believe that. I think insight and sentiment, if you can get your web out there and capture that insight and sentiment, if somebody's walking in to, right, we know that everyone who's got a gas boiler is going to have it serviced. Okay, that's a given. If every person who walks in to a home to service a gas boiler asked some questions, had a conversation, had a cup of tea, whatever happens when they go in, some people say, well, I'll have a quick coffee while I'm doing it, and all of that. If that discussion happens and that insight is captured, that's really, really valuable insight and data. And you're probably going to get a better hit rate from that than you are by sending out a survey or a checklist, because typically you'll get quite a low return rate on things like that. So if you do both of those things, then what you do is you pull all that together and you go, right, what's this telling me? And then the final bit that I think is really, really valuable is what your instinct and your gut and your experience is telling you. So if the data is telling you one thing and the sentiment and the feedback is telling you something, and you add that together and you've then got a bit of a view of what you're being told. If you then think, does it actually feel like that? You know, is my gut telling me that that's probably right? So I think all of those things together can then overcome that issue with data. So while your data is being refreshed, while your data is being improved, while you're working on your data quality, while you're working on your data maturity, you can still do all of that other stuff. You know, let's start now. Let's start now overcoming some of those barriers. Let's not wait for perfection, because if we wait for perfection, we're going to get caught out and we're going to get a really rubbish C grade.
Absolutely that. I sometimes I sometimes try and think of these sorts of things on that like varying ends of extremities in terms of scale. So if you were to look at implementing some sort of service change with absolutely zero customer feedback, obviously that's completely against the new sort of consumer regulation. Also, obviously morally that can't happen either. Other end of the spectrum would be to canvas and get feedback, detailed insight from every single customer, which isn't going to happen either. It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, but you can't wait to get to as high as possible to sort of make that action, because as things change and evolve over time, those sorts of things you kind of touched upon before, we hear the term black hole quite a lot in these sessions, don't we, that we run with tenants, in terms of my feedback goes into a black hole, nothing happens with it. That scale, it is somewhere in the middle, but as soon as you get to a place where you feel like you do have a relevant level of insight, then action needs to happen at that point, I think. Yeah,
definitely.
Thank you for that. The next question was, we're a housing association with a diverse customer base. How can we ensure we are accounting for varying needs when it comes to engagement and implementation of service design?
Yeah, I mean, that's again another real challenge. If you don't know customers' needs and preferences, how can you design services around those customer needs and preferences? And I must admit, over the years, I've seen some horror stories of this. You know, a great example is rent letters that go out, and I know that this isn't a one-off, rent letters that have gone out that say, if you require your letter in a different format because of access needs, do call us and let us know. Well, if you can't read the letter, can you read the call to action to let you know that you need it in a different format? So what you need to do is you need to ensure that you've got a method of capturing those needs and preferences, again through digital forms, through telephone contact. And again, that's easier said than done, actually, because if you're under pressure on your call wait times, layering in additional questions can A, be frustrating for the customer, and B, frustrating for the contact centre service advisor, because they're trying to get onto the next call. But I think if you don't start that process of capturing that information and that data, then you're never going to be able to really tailor your services. And my advice would be and then actually look at some cross-section groups where you get some groups together and you make sure you've got representation from people with diverse needs and preferences, and then you extrapolate that to what you already know about the organisation, and you could quite quickly then get what I would call an access needs database or system, or loaded into your system, where you can quite specifically understand all of those needs and preferences, and then ensure that your communication and your channels that you use address those needs and preferences. There isn't an easy way to do that. I'd love to tell you, actually, if you do A, B and C, you'll be nailed and all your needs and preferences will be met. Because if your customer data is poor, and it is patchy across the sector at the moment, if your customer data is poor, you've got to do the heavy lifting to get that right. And I would say just persist with that. I've worked with an organisation recently where they managed to get their arms around all of their customer needs and preferences in about 4 weeks. But they did that using that multi-channel approach and those tentacles I talked about. So every single interaction, irrespective of what it was, whether it was repair, whether it was servicing, whether it was sustainability, neighbourhoods, they asked those questions or left a form with those questions. And there's all sorts of little tips I'd give you for that. So for example, I know organisations who tried to drive participation, and I know we've had this question, Liv, so I might be kind of jumping to another question that you've been asked about participation. If you send something out and go, log on to this or sign up here and get your service in this way, typically you don't get a really, really good hit rate with that. But if you go in with a device and you go, oh, actually, while I'm here, let me just explain to you how this works. Let's sign you in now. Let's log up now. Now, again, these things do take time, but it will absolutely save you time, because you will then be able to reduce contact centre volume. You'll be able to have more transparent service delivery. You'll be repairing trust. So it is worth that investment to start with in capacity to make that happen. And there's no way, I wish I could tell you there's an easy way to do it. There isn't an easy way. It is hard yards to get to that baseline position.
Yeah. We've seen it work, and obviously this is only one of those channels that I suppose you're kind of referring to, that multi-channel approach. But from our perspective, is from the software provision that we put forward in terms of self-service portals and apps and things, we've seen that coming quite useful for this, because and this obviously, as I say, it's only one of these arms because it is only going to address those digital natives and sort of portal users. But as you've got that customer there in terms of registered, logged in, and therefore they've been presented with their own data from your internal systems to interact with in some way, whether that be look at balance, pay rent, or report repair, and having that connection into that internal system, it's a great chance at that point to ask them about contact preferences or appointment preferences in terms of when they prefer to have visits for access purposes and those sorts of things. But again, as you put it, there's no real sort of silver bullet or easy answer there, is it? It's one of those things which need to be addressed a few different ways, and those sorts of things can help, I guess.
I definitely agree with that. I think also, kind of, as you were saying, Jake and Amanda, the importance of kind of finding out needs and preferences once, but also making sure that we're routinely asking, because these needs and preferences can change on a daily basis, really. And so kind of keeping that narrative with customers and tenants to say, have your needs and preferences changed? Obviously not in those certain terms, but understanding those needs and preferences kind of on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and sometimes we see that check-in not being done other than at tenancy sign-up, and we know that people stay in homes for a very, very long time. I mean, I've just been working with a particular group of customers who were kind of in their 40s when they signed up, and they're now nearly 80. So their needs are totally different to what's on that original record.
Definitely. Thank you for that. The next question was, what would you say are some of the important key metrics to consider when measuring the success of that customer engagement piece?
I think the first one, I mean, there's a really obvious outturn, isn't there? Because there is the new tenant satisfaction measures. If your customers are engaged and your customers are feeling that they've got a voice, you're likely to have higher satisfaction. So that's a really obvious one, and potentially quite a linear one. There are other areas that I think are also important. So things like your levels of engagement. So when you're working on a particular project, or you're working on a piece of design, the levels of people who contribute to that can be a really important metric. And contribution doesn't have to be sat in a room workshopping it. Contribution can be sending some ideas in a chat room, participating in discussion, responding to an online survey. I think, I would describe participation as being the broadest possible sense. So that multi-channel, channel of choice, inputting in a way that suits the individual, both their time capacity, their contact preferences, that's really important. I think 100% achievement of access requirements. So if we don't hit 100% of access requirements, which I appreciate is difficult, you've got everything from language to method of communication. One of the things I was doing first thing this morning was signing off an audio recording for people who are visually impaired, who don't have access to Braille letters. So that can be, a really important way of reaching people. But I think the final area, because the reason I was just drifting then for a second, the reason that I think it's important to hit 100% of those access requirements. If you don't hit 100%, it means that some of your customers are completely in the dark. They're not communicated with, they don't understand things, they don't have a voice. And we know through disability research that you know, often customers with disabilities feel already that they don't have a voice. So to not be able to read communication from you or participate in things that are happening in your organisation can feel extremely isolating. So that's really, really important. I think the final one that I would mention, which is it's a little bit harder to measure, but I think it's a really important metric, is that people feel that their ideas can be visibly seen. So, you know, using, you know, really quite old school methods like you said we did. You know, if 50% of your customers ask for something really specific, and then you put that really specific thing into design, seeing that played back in an evidence-based way can be a really powerful metric. And you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the customer. You've got to say, look, you know, we want people to tell us what their preferences are. We want them to use a certain channel to contact us, and that's our motivation. But what's in it for them? You know, you've got to be really clear about what's in it for them. You know, think about what would make their life easier. So, you know, we know that digital communication makes life easier for creating capacity, for building that relationship and that rapport, building that trust. But one of the things that's really in it for the customer is that total transparency of service, that total transparency of that end-to-end process, everything recorded, everybody having the same view of that thing. So when we're trying to get people to do things and incentivize them to do things, let's flip it and not talk about how we're making our life easier. Let's talk about what's in it for them. Because if we're honest, you know, one of the reasons why we want to channel shift is we want to increase capacity, because we're really up against it because of those first two slides that I covered at the start. But there is lots in it for the customer, and let's start really talking about that narrative.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think over time that involvement from customers has kind of got higher, more involvement, or less? How do you think that's with your kind of working with the sector? How have you seen that?
I've seen it increase, but what I haven't seen increase enough is the diversity and breadth of voice. So I think typically, and I'm saying typically, I'm choosing my words carefully because clearly I don't work with every organisation in the sector, but I think typically we tend to see an older demographic that are in involved customer groups, often people who are retired. You know, we don't always see the full customer base reflected in customer panels and customer groups and reviews. So I think it's 100% increased in terms of profile for the landlord. I think landlords are really wrestling with it, and it's on their top list of priorities. You know, we know that management spend this year, for example, across the sector, we know repairs and maintenance spend has gone up, but management spend has also gone up. Our operating costs have gone up across the sector, because we're trying to get ready for regulation. You know, that spend has gone up. It's largely driven by three things, that management spend: transformation, which is a lot of the technology improvements that a lot of you will be managing and leading, and we're working with you on. It's change management and readiness, and the third area is consumer regulation readiness. So I think the desire's gone up, I think the activity's gone up, I think the spend's gone up. I think people are putting more spend into this area in organisations. I think the numbers of people getting involved have gone up, but we still haven't quite nailed that mix, that breadth and that diversity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Do we have time for one more, or are we up, Jake?
Yeah, I think I did one just pop in the. Was that a question?
Oh, yes, we did. Yeah, perfect timing.
I just saw it flash up and then.
Yeah. One from Abigail: is there any recommendations you would make for engaging some of the younger residents or the more diverse groups?
Yeah, that is a brilliant question, and it really plays to that point I was just making previously, Abigail. So I think that you've got to consider your channel and approach and timing. So typically your more vulnerable groups will have different access needs, so you need to make sure that any of your opportunities to input, to contribute, to participate, have multi-access, multi-channel opportunity to do so. The second thing is, for the younger one, is a really interesting one, because loads of organisations are wrestling with this. We've got to make it a bit cooler. It's, you know, I mean, over the years, I've sat in, and I can say this because I'm quite old, yeah, over the years, Jake and Liv less so, but over the years, I've sat in, you know, lots and lots of working groups, and the age profile is much higher. It's definitely much higher. And the dialogue, therefore, can be less relevant and less interesting to a younger person, because different stage of life, different challenges, different perspective, different, you know, kind of era that we've all grown up in. So I think what's important is that we make sure that some of the dialogue is in a more modern way, digital chat, you know, chat groups, little working groups where, you know, you're using those chat rooms and digital channels and all the things that younger people will be using in their day-to-day interactions, social media, etc. And some of those approaches will tend to drive participation. And the other thing is as well, particularly the younger population, there's a lot of economic and fiscal data on how the younger generation are obviously disadvantaged compared to other previous generations because of the economic crisis and the cost of living, and in particular the cost of housing, of course. Incentives can work as well for that group. You know, it could be as simple as vouchers, it could be as simple as an opportunity to win something. You know, there's quite a few ways that you can look at doing that, or putting on a social as well. That's the other one that I've seen work quite well. Just picking a moment that works time wise in a location that's probably quite relevant, and say drop in. You could drop in online, you can, you know, we'll meet, have a drink, have a bite to eat. So just making it a bit more interesting than a meeting talking about stuff.
Yeah. And we were discussing something quite similar, Amanda, weren't we, at Housing Digital a couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about the fact that there is always going to be that remit of customers, and sometimes it can be the sort of the youngest segment who just want to have a house and just want to have that home sort of looked after in terms of maintained, and don't necessarily want to engage with these sorts of things. But what we were talking about there is that in and of itself is a customer preference of theirs, and we can't really just sort of assume that that's the case for those. It's have we actually got that sort of preference captured, and then that feeds back into that point of the channels, I suppose, it's most relevant for them, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also was being creative about how we do it. I mean, there's nothing wrong, is there, with why can't you have a half an hour touchdown digitally that people can do, share their views, somebody's capturing it all, put it on a group chat, and then actually we move on and we've got all of that insight captured. I was at an organisation last night at a committee meeting, a formal committee meeting with customers. It wasn't a very diverse group, because the people who attended tended to be older, had been involved for years, because that's the other thing, you tend to get the same people volunteering for everything, so then you're still not capturing that diversity of view. And you know what, the meeting went on 3 hours. I mean, you know, how many people want to sit locked in a room for 3 hours on a Wednesday night discussing a load of stuff? You know, let's get creative about how, you know, contributing does not mean giving your life away and sitting for 3 hours in a meeting room. Contributing can be short, sharp, punchy, relevant. So they would be my tips.
Great stuff. Hopefully that answers your question okay there, Abigail, but thank you for that, Amanda. Yeah, I think that kind of leads us to sort of closing, I suppose. So thanks for that question, and also for those of you who submitted those questions earlier on. And once again, thank you, Amanda, for joining us and sort of covering the topic so eloquently as always. But yeah, just to, I suppose, link to that final point you were making, really, just link to the following session that we have, which is last Thursday of March, so the 28th. We've got our CEO, Rob Quayle, joining us on the Housing Hive then, but also we have Julia Mixter, who's Director of Transformation at Raven Housing Trust, and after the very recent announcement, soon to be Anchor. She's going to be joining us to talk about the sort of the process and the program that she's kind of spearheaded at Raven in terms of digital transformation programs, which I find the interesting thing about when Julia speaks in terms of how honest she is about I guess, the challenges that have sort of happened along the way. They're often, when we talk about digital transformation programs, we always talk about, okay, we did this, did that, involved these people, the outcome was great, and this is the sort of benefit. Whereas Julie will be quite honest about some of the learnings and challenges that they kind of had to overcome along the way. So looking forward to that one. It should be really good. And that's going to be all focused around the fact that all of these projects that we cover and talk about from a digital transformation point of view, they do, we often begin with the tech or begin with the processes or the procedures, and really what we're trying to do here is improve the lives of people in terms of customers. It's less about the property, it's more about the person in the property and sort of making those changes to sort of benefit them. So that'll be the topic for 28th of March, so feel free to head over to the website to register for that one. Hopefully we'll see you there. But yeah, finally, just wanted to thank you all again for taking the time to join us. Thanks, Liv, for doing those questions, and Amanda for obviously putting the time and effort into the prep for this and covering the topics as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn, etc., with any more questions, feel free.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely to see you all. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.